What's going on, gamers? This is Valkyrie Hunter here, and we have sadly come to the conclusion to our playthrough of Metroid Prime. I know. It was the most riveting content ever, but hey, that means it's time for our official review. Now, I have a lot of history with this particular game, which I will dive into in just a minute, so this will be difficult for me to retain my biases in this video, but even with that, I will still do my best in order to keep it as objective as possible for you, in order to get a solid review. In order to display my extensive knowledge and cover all bases, I'll be discussing the story, gameplay, music, art style, some differences between the versions that you can play, and a sprinkle of speedrunning. This is your spoiler warning. If you want to play this game fresh for yourself, I would recommend getting the remastered version for the Switch. It is only around $40 for the digital version, but if you still want a physical copy, those are out there as well, and there's only nothing but positive things to say about this game. So go look at any other channel with more subs or anything like that who have or have not played the game before. People love it for a reason. But if you do wish to stick around, just keep in mind though, I did play the port for the Wii in the Metroid Prime Trilogy for the channel, but I have played and beaten 100% completed every version of the game that there is. So, since there will be a lot of information to discuss in this review, I'll just go ahead and get started now with my personal background. I was first introduced to Metroid Prime and the Metroid series a very long time ago. If I remember correctly, it was actually a gift to me from my grandmother, of all people, way back when. Like when I was 5 or 6 years old, I believe, somewhere around there. Like a small child. Just another stupid kid back then. So I had no idea what a Metroid Prime was, nor anything about the Metroid universe. And boy, was I in for a big surprise. The intro to this game was actually super scary for me back then. Like, I had a genuine fear for the space pirates and their augmented bodies and their grimy laboratories, and it didn't help that they would just pop out from the ceilings or hidden areas. I don't remember too much from my first playthrough, outside of every space pirate location in the game being like a horror section, and that it took me like 28 to 30 hours to officially beat. The fear just really got to me, man. I don't know what to tell you. But I do remember being at the final boss and being upset that I had to stop playing and go to church that Sunday morning, so I left my game running for like a couple hours or so I could come back and finally beat the game. And ever since then, I fell in love with the game, and I had to have more of it. Now, Metroid is my all-time favorite series, and I always make time to replay the games every year or so. Dozens of playthroughs on my Gamecube at home or while traveling in our family trailer, multiple runs on the trilogy ever since that game launched in like 2009, and some speedrunning and reminiscing on the remastered release since this last February. So there's no need for me to recount every hour that I spent playing this game, because one, it's a lot, and two, I'm pretty sure you get the idea by now of how much experience I have with this. So let's talk version differences now. As of now, there are currently 3 main versions of the game that are available to play. And I say main versions because there's technically an alternate way to play for my PC gamers out there, which is referred to as Prime Hack. It essentially brings the Trilogy collection and transfers the controls to make it possible to run off of a mouse and keyboard. However, if you happen to know how Nintendo runs things, that emulator is a big no-no, due to it being simply an emulation of their own product. I mean, I partially understand where they're coming from, but it still comes off as being a big, like, asshole corporation that is stingy with fan games without giving people a reasonable way to play these old games themselves. I mean, at least without spending a fortune on these games on Amazon or eBay. Ideally, in Nintendo's eyes here, there are 3 versions. The original release and a couple of subsequent packages released later for the Gamecube, the Prime Trilogy port for the Wii, which brought the use of motion controls, and the newly released remastered version, which came out for the Switch back in February of this year. Between the GameCube and Wii versions, there are only some minor differences outside of the obvious controller change. There were some small changes to enemy placement, which is a nitpick of mine as a purist, but that's just me. A small boost to the graphical fidelity and textures, as well as a logbook retcon, which I will discuss in detail more later. The remaster, if you think about it, is not very different in most aspects, but it did get a beautiful overhaul to the textures, effects, and graphics for the whole game. It is almost brand new, and it rivals some games on PS4 and PS5. Like, it is incredible. Not to mention that this is also the most accessible version in terms of accessibility to consumers and accessibility to playstyles and gamers. Remastered has tons of options for controls, heads-up display settings, visual filters, to make sure that any gamer who picks this up is comfortable and able to experience the game to the fullest. At the end of the day, though, it is a game that did come out originally in 2002. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of what makes this game really special to me and the thousands of players that just recently got onto the hype train known as Metroid Prime. The story of Metroid Prime is within the first half of the Metroid series, but it creates its own setting and trilogy that is separate from the main plot of Metroid, which makes it easy to jump straight into as a newer player, like I once was back when I was a kid. The trilogy lands itself technically in between the first game, Metroid, and its sequel, Metroid 2, Return of Samus, or Samus Returns if you play the 3DS remake. It follows our protagonist, Samus Aran, as she receives a distress beacon from an unknown ship. Quick to realize, turns out the ship is the frigate Orpheon, which is a space pirate vessel. She boards the ship only to find most of the crew wounded, dead, or long gone, and the place is in complete disarray. It's a miracle that their communications worked in order to get a beacon out in the first place. But as Samus keeps exploring the ship to figure out what the hell is going on, she finds multiple stations of wildlife that have been tested on, and as well as large cargo boxes filled with the substance known as Phazon. Not really sure what that is, but let's keep that in the back of our mind for later. She keeps going, only to find more dead crew and that thing, a parasite queen, which becomes more harmful after its disposal. The ship is collapsing, falling apart at the seams now, and on the way out, you spot Ridley. If you had played the first game in the series, Ridley is this giant space dragon that you killed off in that game in order to progress to the final area. Somehow he's been rebuilt. Somehow he's returned. But better. He escapes through the roof as you continue to return to your ship, and as you reach the final elevator, an explosion knocks Samus back and makes her suit have major malfunctions. Not good, but there is no time to worry. Samus eventually makes it back to her ship just in time to give chase, but alas, she loses Ridley when entering the planet's atmosphere. And now, after this intro, the game kicks it back into first gear and really slows down. This juxtaposition between the high intensity of escaping a sinking ship to the calm rain in a bountiful forest really sets the mood for the rest of this adventure. We have our goal. Take out Ridley. But we gotta get our strength back first. And after you retake control of Samus, the direct storytelling takes more of a background role instead of being more front and center. While this is also the case within the frigate Orpheon, the story of Tallon 4 and the lore of the factions involved are encapsulated in this recordable logbook entries, which are completely optional. If you did take the time to read them, they describe the involvement of the Chozo on the planet, as well as the space pirates and this Phazon resource that they want so badly. The logs detail the Chozo as these nomadic bird-like beings that happened upon Tallon 4 like many years ago. They weave stories of a beautiful planet with diverse environments and exquisite beauty. But after some time, a meteorite crash landed onto the planet, dumping this Phazon onto the planet's surface. Phazon acts like a radioactive substance which mutates and affects everything it comes into contact with. Because of its unstable nature, it began to affect the planet for the worse. This is where we start to see differences in the narrative depending on the version that you play and you pick up. The earlier versions of the Gamecube describe the meteor as having contained a being that feasted on Phazon and grew to be a frightening monster. In order to stop the spread of Phazon and halt this monster from wreaking any havoc, the Chozo created a cipher and locked the meteorite away in what is now referred to as the impact crater. But if you play the trilogy version changes this to describe the meteorite only bringing Phazon to the planet, and not some giant monster with it as well. But what remains the same is that the Chozo are also on their way to entering a higher plane of existence. And there's a small section in like 1 or 2 log entries that describe that eventually a hero will arrive to rid the planet of this Phazon toxin. You need to see Samus as, a little prediction years before the events of the game even take place. But as Samus continues exploring the lands of Tallon 4, she also gets a deeper look as to the space pirate involvement and their fascination with Phazon. The pirates are trying to use Phazon in order to create more resilient and stronger forces for use in their military conquests. So, combine a volatile, radioactive substance with Metroids, which are these energy-sapping little jellos that they already want to use for warfare, you get even greater combat potential and hopefully positive results towards their objectives. They are also using this on practically any animal they can get their hands on, including themselves, hence the animals locked up in their ship in orbit of the planet. They are hoping for this Phazon to be a magical solution for power and prowess over their enemies. Samus doesn't like that one bit, so she thrashes their stations and steals their technology whenever she can. And these space pirate logs reveal their findings for the potential for Phazon as a mutagen and their intentions. It also brings up the other half of the retcon that was done in the trilogy version. The canon story now is that the pirates brought Metroids onto the planet with their research vessels, and one of them escaped and wound its way into the impact crater, which turned it into this behemoth of a final boss. Overall, it's a minor change that just tries to help this game flow with its sequels and the overarching story of the Prime Trilogy. But still doesn't fully work in my mind, because the cipher was built and made to keep out Phazon a long time ago, even way before the Space Pirates showed up, but it at least works a little bit better. Especially when you have some knowledge of the third game in the trilogy in mind. Because without that third game, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But eventually, when I play that third game, you'll see how this all ties together. But for now, it's still kind of like a little plot hole. And at some point in Samus's adventure across the planet, she finds herself at the entrance to the impact crater and the cipher that the Chozo worked so hard to construct. In order for her to thwart the space pirate plans and rid the planet of Phazon, she has to collect 12 artifacts that are spread around the globe in order to unlock the seal. She eventually does this and returns the artifacts only to be met by Ridley, who breaks the cipher and challenges you to a fight. And after kicking his middle ass, the remnants of the Chozo, who laid the foundation for the cipher, come together to let you access the source of Phazon. I always thought that this was a little strange, considering the fact that Chozo ghosts have been fighting Samus and hindering her progress multiple times at this point. But turns out, the trilogy version describes these ghosts as being part of the Chozo who stayed behind to help seal off the meteorite. They were corrupted by the Phazon and its properties and placed in a sort of in-between state, between dimensions. We'll have the idea explored a little bit more in the immediate sequel, but in the meantime, that doesn't really explain the difference between these ghosts and the ones from the rest of the game. Maybe it's like a rite of passage, and Samus has proven herself to be a righteous person and fulfill the prophecy that they have to take on this foreign threat, but we never really know for sure. That's just my assumption, but I guess if you would like to make your own opinion, you're welcome to play the game or just read the logs yourself and form your own conclusion, because that's the one that I'm kind of getting from here. But anyway, Samus then enters the crater and defeats Metroid Prime as well as the source of Phazon on Tallon 4. The last cutscene that we see is this bubbling puddle of pure Phazon and the black sentient arm that reaches out and sprouts an eyeball in its hand. And for a Nintendo IP, Metroid Prime is actually kind of brutal if you think about it. The best part, though, is that it is entirely up to the player whether or not the story gets unearthed. Space pirates can remain as evil bad guys, or they can have some extra flavor with the logs. The Chozo could just be the name of a set of ruins and only slightly hinted at without the logs. And even with these details gained or missed, the story still remains relatively simple and easy for most to comprehend on their first read. The story fits into this category for me for being more involved with the Mario game, but still not overly bloated with content. It is also interesting to see the simple beginning to the trilogy within its context to the other games. But without further delay, let's talk about gameplay. I mean, it is a video game after all, right? Metroid Prime takes the series in an all-new dimension. Literally. Before the Prime series, Metroid was known to be a fast-paced, side-scrolling action game filled with exploration and adventure. And during Prime's development, people were skeptical that the game would hold up when compared to its 2D foundation. But after many ideas came and went, the developers at Retro Studios and Nintendo finally decided to make the game a first-person experience, which was a great decision in the long run. The new perspective really helped put players in Samus's boots and feel like they were the ones gallivanting around Tallon 4 with a giant arm cannon. And since the game is in first person, that brought about an entirely new system that Metroid has never seen before, and that is the visor. Starting with the basic combat visor, this lets you control Samus and have a heads-up display showing your hit points, ammo counter for missiles, motion detector, map of explored and unexplored territory, lists of different beam weapons and other visor functions, and even a hazard meter. It's so surprising how a seemingly simple addition of a visor and a heads-up display adds so much more depth and sense of realism to this universe. It's crazy to me, and I love it so much. The scan visor that I mentioned is the biggest addition to the franchise and allows for so much more lore and detail to help with the environmental storytelling that Metroid is originally known for. The thermal visor turns Samus into a Navy SEAL of sorts and lets her see heat signatures. This also helps with enemy detection and is also used for some puzzle solving in the form of power outages. I will admit though, the remastered version kind of messes this up a little bit. If you were to play the Wii or the original version, it still is very a crisp image by comparison, right? Crisp for the graphics that are in this game. But then if you play the remastered version, it's unnecessarily blurry. There's a lot of motion blur, and it's not exactly a clear image when you're looking through it. So that did leave a lot of people kind of feeling a bit dizzy, and it just didn't feel good to be in the thermal visor for extended periods of time, which I got that too. I understand. It's just kind of a bit of a weird change, but a change nonetheless. And the X-ray visor serves a similar purpose to the thermal, but it somehow helps detect hidden walls and make certain enemies easier to fight, like the Chozo ghosts. Don't really know what to say about that, because it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. But it's a game, I guess. So I guess I'll just chalk it up as to being oh, it's video game stuff, so it's not going to work like a real X-ray ray works in real life. I don't know, something like that. But it does help you fight the Chozo ghost, so that makes that a little bit less annoying. The arm cannon is, of course, your main tool for dealing out the damage. You start out with just this power beam, which has a fast fire rate but poor damage, and it's good enough for the first chunk of the game, but it easily gets outclassed by other beams that you receive later on. The wave beam is an electrical-based weapon that has homing properties and a stun effect, and the game also has you use this in conjunction with the thermal visor to complete those power source puzzles. And if you get good enough at the combat to be able to juggle multiple enemies at once, the stun effect can be very beneficial. Instead of just hitting enemies and potentially having knockback with their charge beam from the power beam, the stun just, freezes them in their place, and you can just kind of juggle multiple enemies and just make them a joke. Make it a lot easier for you. But what really makes enemies a joke is the ice beam. Especially when paired with a missile, because as soon as you are able to, either it has a lot of power and it's very slow fire rate, but if you don't just completely kill enemies off of a charge beam or a couple of shots, and you fully freeze them, a single missile takes them out too. So it's very good for quick dispatchal of enemies like Metroids or certain pirates in the game, and some enemies are just if you can freeze them, you can just
shatter them apart and forget about them. But there is a small nitpick that I have here too between the versions, that the original version let you do this with every enemy that could be frozen. The remastered version patched it to where the ice pirates, like those guys that kind of re-engineered Samus's beam weapons, were able to be frozen, but they couldn't be shattered by missiles. And I thought that was a weird change to put in, because it's like, okay, well now if I have like multiple ice pirates in a room, like in the where you get that room where you get the power bomb, it's like, okay, I can freeze all of them and juggle them, but now I'm just looking at a bunch of frozen enemies and shooting them over and over again. Instead, when I can just do the same thing, but have it all be done a lot quicker if I could just freeze them and then break them. I don't know, like, it's not more engaging for me to shoot a stationary target, especially if it's frozen. I mean, if it somehow didn't freeze the space pirates, then maybe that would be a little bit more interesting, but it lets me freeze them, it just doesn't let me break them. So, kind of strange, but let us not forget the almighty plasma beam, which can clear out rooms of enemies in mere seconds. Like, it's pretty wild how much of a power jump there is just with the beams. Power beam, fast but weak. Then wave beam. Okay, you get a bit of a stun. You can do some puzzles with it. Has some homing capability, so it makes fighting combat a little bit easier. Ice beam, freeze, break, repeat, or just, lead your shots enough to be able to land some pretty meaty hits. And then plasma beam, rip, tear, burn, incinerate, atomize enemies. Like, it's great. It's super crazy. And there also are a couple of what they call beam combos in this game that use missiles in conjunction with a charge shot. So it's not exactly like, if you were to play the other games, it's not exactly like upgrades to the missile. Like, Super Missile acts just like a complement to the power beam, for example. And they're honestly not great. Kind of hurts and sucks to say that, but I mean, if I'm being honest, they're just like, they do bring some variation to the combat, but they're not super like impactful. For example, like the flamethrower and the wave buster both eat up a ton of missiles, since they are a continuous sort of combo, and the ice spreader is like the super missile, but lays out a sheet of ice upon impact and takes double the missiles. Like, they're just not really super useful, and the flamethrower sucks. Like, you would think a flamethrower, like if you have seen videos of it or seen one in real life, it's like a gigantic jet of flame, lots of smoke, like a screaming howl from a flamethrower. And this one's just kind of like pitiful. Kind of sucks. Plus, it doesn't really do like a ton of damage itself. Its main draw, I guess, is that it provides a lot of like overtime burn damage, I suppose. But it doesn't really like melt enemies. You know what I mean? Like, it just seems like it's kind of underpowerful. Still uses a ton of missiles. Not really that exciting to look at. And it's just kind of meh. Wave Buster's a little bit better. I mean, it's like you're literally shooting like a Ghostbuster ray at people, but of course the negative is that it uses a ton of missiles, but at least it homes onto targets without you having to lock onto them. So just whip it out and you just start like blasting people and draining energy around, and it does help with some that are harder to lock onto, but again, the missile draw is a bit much, especially if you haven't collected a lot of upgrades in the first place. But at the end of the day, it does add a little bit of extra variety to the combat and a way to use up the potential 250 missiles that you can collect. So it's a give and take. I mean, you could get away with not grabbing all of them besides the super missile. I mean, because the super missile is tied to progression of the game. But it doesn't hurt to grab them besides just a little extra time to find them. It's kind of how I feel. A little bit neutral about it in the end. But hey, if we switch gears a little bit, the Morph Ball is a great incorporation of a little bit of third person and a new method of travel and puzzle solving. I mean, it was in older games, but just the way that they handle it here, I think, is really cool. I mean, the Spider Ball and the Boost Ball upgrades being like my favorite for the movement, and Power Bomb's feeling like a mini nuke. I mean, come on, look at the explosion. And the developers really gave Samus like a whole armor of weaponry in this game, and you can really feel the growth and power in the latter half of your playthrough. Like, just getting some like extra movement options to be able to traverse gaps and get through rooms a lot quicker, to being able to just completely obliterate enemies or get through small gaps and help with exploration. Like, it's really cool. It's really great. I think it's a pretty like natural progression of your power levels too. But We'll admit a couple of faults here, starting with the controls. The controls for the original release are awkward for those who have a lot of experience with other FPS games, because instead of there being dual stick controls like every other game, you're only allotted one stick for movement and aiming. It uses the C stick for changing beam weapons, and thankfully there's a lock-on feature that helps retain target acquisition, but it is difficult to aim and hit targets that are fast moving or right above your head, unlike the original controls. A pro about the setup is the fact that switching beams and visors is seamless, like butter. Just a flick of the C-stick or a press of the D-pad instantly changes your beam or switches visor modes. On the flip side, the Wii version utilizes motion controls, which makes shot placement a lot more accurate, even without the lock-on feature. But the downfall of these controls is that visor and beam switching is not as quick or as smooth as before, forcing you to bring up a hidden menu when pointing to your beam or visor of choice before making the switch. And in this game, especially with some of the later boss fights, the game really likes to use your current loadout and all of the upgrades you have before and use them in combat. So slowing down and breaking the pacing of the combat by like having to pull up a menu and switch to whatever you need to switch to in the moment is a little clunky. I mean, it's not terrible, but it's not my preferred play style. And I mean, it seems like also default turning speeds seem to be a little bit slower on the trilogy than on the original version, but that could also just be me. I mean, I have most experience playing on the Gamecube. I just find that that's my favorite version, and it's close to the original as I can get. So, I mean, I don't have the actual original release. I have like a couple patches later that comes with a Metroid Prime 2 bonus demo disc, which is cool. I don't know. It's just like, as a hardcore fan, I just seem to prefer the original GameCube controls. Something about the controller and its goofy-ass layout just really makes sense in my mind. Plus, like I said, I've played this game a ton on my old little lunchbox, so my bias is showing a little bit. But this is one aspect where the remastered shines. It gives you an option for both original and pointer controls, while also creating a dual-stick method for the FPS gamers, and a hybrid option to complement most anybody who would play this game. I mean, overall, there are pros and cons to each, but every playstyle that has been implemented is a solid choice, and it's really only boiled down to personal preference and experience with other games or with Metroid. So, can't really go wrong with there. And the general premise of the game itself is simple in concept. You are alone on an alien planet, and you need to scour the lands in order to find more power-ups and upgrades to make yourself a formidable opponent. Game does give you a little taste of that power during the intro, but it takes that power away and leaves you with little to nothing left. One major complaint that I see others making online is that the exploration and the backtracking can be a bit much. Honestly, that's perfectly understandable. I wish that the map had waypoints that I could place to denote certain landmarks or places that I wanted to revisit at a later time, but sadly the map only really tells you of places that you have set foot in before. Not fully explored, set foot in before. As soon as you enter the doorway of like a blue room, it just turns orange, and that's kind of it. So the map kind of leaves some bits to be desired, but I mean, that's granted if you've even found a map station to begin with to even see these untouched rooms. So I don't know, map could be a little bit better, and it kind of gets better later on, but not by much. So it's a simple map. It's definitely a simple map. And while I understand and I'm sympathetic to those who have gotten lost in the game, I would try to look at it in a different light. Instead of thinking that the game is bullshit or that maybe you aren't smart enough to figure it out, I see it as like a small achievement when I do find the right path. I may not be the smartest guy ever, smartest gamer ever, but it does still give me that little rush of content whenever I figure out a puzzle or a difficult obstacle on my own. But I mean, for those who decide against the challenge, there is a helpful hint system that you can turn on, which will only provide help after a certain amount of time has passed. And I like the way that they do the hint system because it just gives you the room that you need to be in instead of just holding your hand to the door. So it still gives you like that sense of discovery while nudging you in the right direction at the same time. So I think it's a pretty good balance for a hint system. This does not absolve the amount of backtracking that is in the game. It definitely is not for everybody. So, I mean, it's meant to be a more like methodical game that more kind of rewards patience and thorough explanation, but it's it's like almost the opposite of 2D Metroid games. So those who have gone from 2D and are jumping to 3D, it's like it's a pretty drastic change. And I was watching a couple of reviews just to kind of refreshen my knowledge on what other people's opinions are for this. And there was one that I came across who was a 2D Metroid fan and had just gotten into the 3D games of the remaster and was really not a fan. Just for the sense that it really slowed everything down. It was like too methodical, and the sense of like kind of getting lost wasn't really super appealing. Now, don't get me wrong, we'll review those games later on, but generally the 2D games like to have that replayability in the sense of like, okay, there's like alternate paths and there's faster ways to do things, and Metroid Prime doesn't really have that. Metroid Prime just kind of is like, it's a giant world and you're exploring, and that's it. The world is set up the way that it is, and there isn't really too many like shortcuts or things that aren't like, expressly made for certain points and portions in the game. So it's a different game. It is still Metroid. It still has that exploration and that isolation and that like, growth and that Metroidvania style of gameplay, but it goes about it in a different way, and it's definitely not everybody's cup of tea. So I mean, I've played this game enough to have a pretty effective route for collecting these while doing minimal backtracking, but that doesn't help the casual new player help find the artifacts, because that's like the main focus of that complaint is the hunt for the artifacts afterward. Because after the Omega Pirate, the game just kind of turns into a collectathon as you have the opportunity to grab any last minute upgrades or pickups and searching for the artifacts that you may have missed on the playthrough. To reference that review that I was talking about again, I believe the guy said that he only found like 4 while just playing the game normally, and then had to go backtrack back to the temple to turn them in, and then when you turn them into the temple, then the temple was able to unlock, I guess, like a couple of extra hints for other ones, and potentially you were just there. So that's kind of the backtracking that I was like not okay with that I mentioned earlier, because potentially you're going across the whole planet to go back to a place that you may or may not have already been to or had just been to. So it can be a little frustrating, but I do like the backtracking so long as I'm not forced to go from one side to the other too often. Once in a while is okay, but especially that end portion there, it could be a lot if you are not as experienced as I am. But if we're talking about the enemies and the bosses, they're a little hit and miss for me. I understand the concept behind some of the early game enemies and bosses and the idea that Samus is getting back to her powerful state, but one of the bosses is literally a trash compactor with a flamethrower and a hive of bees. Like, that just sounds like a fun afternoon in the country. Not a boss for Samus Aran. Like, even with her power-ups at that point in the game, she's not like that weak, but it's just kind of, it's like the idea of like you're exploring the planet and the planet has some hostile life forms, and these are some of the remnants there, and I guess for some reason a trash compactor is holding morph ball bombs. I don't know. The Chozo ghosts also come off as more of an annoyance rather than a real threat. Thankfully they don't lock the doors most of the time. There are a few instances where there is like no quick exit out of the room and the game just forces you to fight them. And the X-ray visor evens out the playing field, but without it, you're just sitting in a corner waiting for them to appear so you can damage them. Not very fun or engaging. Doesn't happen too often, though, like I said. And it definitely doesn't happen too often before the X-ray visor. Like, there's like a couple instances where the doors will lock and you have to fight ghosts. Like, it's almost like a scripted fight, I guess. But it's not too bad. It is annoying, though. The bosses from Flagra on, though, are pretty fun and unique. Needing to disable like solar panels in order for this carnivorous plant to stay in the ground, shooting certain parts of a sentient Phazon being, going head-to-head with a giant space pirate all jacked up on Phazon mutation. Like, these boss fights are all exciting in their own way, and they're pretty unique. They also have, like, I like how they incorporate most, if not all, of your items that you've collected up to that point into fighting the bosses, like especially with Thardus, the giant sentient rock monster. Kind of a weird concept to know, but it's like you got to use your thermal visor to be able to look up targets that are like irradiated but they're not exposed yet, shoot them to be exposed, and then your thermal visor is like overreacting, so then you switch back and you just like pelt the crap out of him with weapons, your super missiles that you just recently got, or your wave beam. And then it's just like, I don't know, I just like the incorporation instead of just being like, oh, well, I found the thermal visor and I did this one puzzle. Like a one and done seems kind of really dumb. But, I mean, shoot, we use the thermal visor and the x-ray for like a good handful of times as soon as, like, pretty much as soon as you get them too, including some of the weapons. It can be a little bit of a weird thing to have to like switch to a different beam to open a door and then switch back to your preferred beam. That's more kind of like for the end game. But, I mean, I get why they do that. It's to kind of like naturally halt progression instead of just being able to skip all the way to the finale or close to the finale without really having any of the beams or being as powerful enough to fight some of the enemies that you would fight. But, you know, it's a design decision, and some people agree with it and some people don't. So I can understand that. But if I did have to make a slight tweak to the boss encounters, though, it would have to mainly be with the final boss, Metroid Prime. The Essence phase is boring as hell when you know what you're doing. I mean, it's a grand set piece. I mean, shoot, you just got done with a giant fight with a huge spider crab radiated like thing, Metroid Prime, and now you're fighting like the pure Phazon essence of it, and it's like, wow, it's really cool. But then you quickly figure out that it's like all you have to do is just dodge attacks till the essence decides to like poop out a puddle of pure Phazon, which sometimes can take an eternity between puddles. If the Metroid Prime Exoskeleton was the final boss, or if they just reworked the Essence phase to at least be a little more interactive or compelling, then maybe I would be more positive about it. But as soon as Metroid Prime is defeated, it really becomes a slog the more times you play the game to get through the second half. Like, first time I was like, wow, it's this giant, like, scary, like, Metroid, like, tentacle monster, and it's like, it's able to, like, breed and produce more Metroids and has, like, these giant shockwaves, but it's like, as soon as you realize that your normal beams can't do anything and you, like, need the puddle, that's kind of it. And it doesn't spawn Metroids, like, all of the time to keep you busy. It only spawns Metroids when the puddle comes out. So, I don't know. I feel like there could have just been a little bit more of interaction, I guess, between the player and the boss to make it be, like, 100% good. But it's just missing that little oomph, I guess, for me. And overall, Metroid Prime, I think, is a great balance of lonely exploration and lore digging and intense action. The controls could take some getting used to, but as soon as you do, there are plenty of baddies to fend off, items to grab, and bosses to slay. And I mean, who doesn't love a good slugfest against giant monsters with a cannon for an arm? Like, come on, bro. Both the music and the art style of the original game still hold up to this day, especially the musical score. The models for enemies and Samus still look fantastic for a game that was originally released in 2002, but some of the textures for the environments got a little washed out over time. I also seem to run into some problems with darker areas being like pitch black and hard to navigate, even with other visors helping me out, though that could just be chalked up to my setup for recording gameplay. Not gonna lie, because I don't remember it always being that dark in those places, but probably just me, so it should be fine. Lighting can be a bit dark though, so might be a problem for other folks as well. The music has some great remixes of previous tunes from older games and even sprinkles in a healthy dose of new tracks that everyone loves. Like, seriously, I have never heard of anyone disliking the music in this game. They only struggle to pick which track is their favorite. And if I had to pick one, I mean, it's a toss-up between Magmoor Caverns, which is a remix, and Phendrana Drifts, the second time you enter in. But do love the war drums of Magmoor Caverns. And the music and the environments create such a persuading tone of loneliness and drives a theme of a grander adventure awaiting you. Like, it's just, I don't know, just for some reason, they just hit it right on the head with, like, the first game, and they just built upon that musical score with subsequent games, and it only keeps getting better. And, oh my lord, Have you laid witness to the graphical overhaul in Prime Remastered? Holy crap, are they gorgeous. The slight tilt into a more animated style instead of just pure, like, grittiness suits a game like Metroid very well, in my opinion. Like, I just can't stop gawking at the remastered port. Oh, like, it just makes me melt thinking about it. But you also can't forget how good the original looks for a game early in the Gamecube's life cycle. Just let that sink in how long ago that was. That was over 20 years ago. Insane, right? I mean, maybe that's just me. Maybe that's just my like nostalgia talking for this game. But like, I mean, hey, go look at some other videos if you don't believe my opinion. Like, everybody seems to think that the graphics, at the very least, looked good back then. And then the remastered, oh, it rivals some PS4 and PS5 games on the Switch. That is just incredible. I have to stop myself from keep talking about it. So let's just move on to speedrunning. So I did also want to touch a little bit on the speedrunning aspect of Metroid Prime as well, because I think it is important to the game's longevity. Just seeing people around the globe trying to beat Prime in as little time as possible was inspiring enough for me to do my own speedrun, if you did see that on the channel. But what I really wanted to get onto was runners either collecting items out of order or skipping them altogether. While I never really thought to do this when I was younger, it brings a whole new layer of replayability to the game, which originally honestly had very little. There wasn't really any sort of unlockables for doing 100% or into the game in a certain time like the other games did. Like the other like handheld games and the 2D scrollers had like an art collection or like different pictures of Samus, either like with her Chozo battle suit on or just in her Zero suit as like a sort of reward. This game doesn't really have that. At least the original game doesn't have that. All it does is it unlocks hard mode when you beat the game. And if you do 100% completion, there's that little, there's that cutscene at the end with, like, the hand coming out of the puddle of Phazon. Woo, scary, but that's kind of it. I mean, if you did happen to beat Metroid Fusion, which came out around the same time, and you connected that directly to your copy of Metroid Prime on the Gamecube, you unlocked the Fusion suit, which, this may just be me, because it seems like a lot of the speedruns that I watch have the suit on. I think it looks ugly as hell in this game. They do not do it justice in the Metroid Prime version. It just looks like a muddled mess. I don't know. Something about it is just very off-putting and just like not as good as it looks in Fusion. I mean, it's supposed to be like this very sleek version of Samus because of some reasons that are some spoiler territory for a different game. But, like, it just still looks very bulky. Without it having, like, the 90s, like, giant shoulders and piercing knee pads and stuff like that. And just, like, it just looks like trash in this game. And I hate that. I hate that it looks bad. But, I don't know. I guess that's just the best that they could do in 2002. It hurts my feelings a little bit. I'm sorry. And, I mean, outside of the Fusion suit and the rewards from the original game, the remastered does do a good job of hiding collectibles like music tracks, 3D models, and concept art behind completion percentages or difficulties. So, remastered is a little bit better. But that feeling of going on the unintended path and becoming too powerful too early is just exhilarating to me. It's like breaking the rules, but with only positive results for you. I mean, it does depend on how you play the game, since the different versions kind of acted like patches almost. I mean, back then the games didn't act like the games that they do now. Yeah, it's my old gamer talking. So every release of the game kind of was just like a patch for the game. Also, just like some either higher graphical fidelity, and they changed a couple things around with enemy placement, or like they just completely tried to stop certain skips and certain items that you could get early. But I mean, come on, the speedrunning community isn't that dumb. They can still get around it. But It's just like, yeah, certain tricks and skips were patched out depending on what version that you played. So obviously, most runners who are very serious about this of getting the quickest time possible play the very, very original version on GameCube. I do think that if you are in love with Metroid as much as I am, that you should try your hand at speedrunning, even if you're nowhere near the world record, or if you don't think you're any good. It's a fun, whole new way to look at and experience the game. Like, just trying to go as fast as possible and maybe get items in a different order just like breathes a little extra life into Metroid Prime. If for some reason you were like me and just played the whole thing start to finish pretty much in the intended order since you started playing, give speedrunning a try, or at least give the route a try. You don't have to do it fast, but just give some of the routes a try and see how you like it. A little bit different, you know. I love Metroid Prime. It is my favorite game and my favorite series due to its simple nature but fun gameplay and intriguing story. The environments and mood were already convincing enough for me back in the 2000s as a kid, and to see my favorite game get a beautiful remaster out of nowhere made me so happy for the franchise and its future. I highly recommend that you play this game for yourself and experience the story of Tallon 4 for yourself. It is easiest to get for the Switch since there is a digital copy. Thankfully, you do not have to try and find a physical copy for the Wii or the Gamecube, because those guys are still going for a hefty price. But this is a must-play game. Truly, 100%. Thank you guys so much for sticking around to the end. I know this was another long video for me, but I just had so much to say about my favorite game. I mean, could you blame me? If you did like the video, go ahead and give it a like, but feel free to dislike it if it wasn't maybe up to your standards. I will say, though, that I would love to hear any criticisms in the comments down below so I can improve and make better videos for you guys, because that is what I'm here for, your guys' entertainment. And if you just adore everything that I'm doing here on the channel and want to see more, then go ahead and subscribe and click on the notification bell to be reminded of when I get another video up. People do seem to be having problems with YouTube's notification system. Like, I will just mention that. So I would recommend following me on Instagram if you happen to have one, since I post my shorts there and updates as to future content coming down the pike. So, thank you guys so much for sticking all the way to the end. And I'll see you in the next video. Auf Wiedersehen.